Welcome back to the Thinking Ape podcast. And today we're talking about the climate and the climate crisis that's going on right now. And we've got Professor Will Steffen here to talk to us. So he's a climate change expert and researcher at ANU. He's also a councillor on the Climate Council of Australia that delivers independent expert information about climate change, a professor at ANU, a senior fellow at the Stockholm Resilience Centre, and a fellow at the Beja Institute of Ecological Economics in Stockholm. He's also an adjunct professor at the University of Canberra, working with the Canberra Urban and Regional Futures Program, and he's a member of the ACT Climate Change Council. He's also the chair of the jury for the Volvo Environment Prize and a member of the International Advisory Board for the Centre for Collective Action Research in Sweden. So I hope I got all that right, and I hope I didn't miss anything, and thank you for coming on.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
First, I'd like to know a bit about you before we get into the climate crisis and everything going on. So do you want to give a bit about how you got into that area and how that kind of became your expertise?
Yeah, it's an interesting story because I actually did my education quite a long time ago now, and I got my PhD in, trying to remember when it was, 1975, I think it was. So I did my undergraduate degree, did all my education back in America.
I can tell that slightly.
Yeah, well, I've been over here for about 40 years, so hopefully sort of the mid-Pacific, perhaps. Anyway, so I come from the middle of America originally, and I graduated from high school in the state of Iowa, which is right in the middle, and I did my first degree actually in chemical engineering, and that was from the University of Missouri, also in the center of the U.S. And then I decided I liked science more than engineering. And I wasn't ready to really actually go to work yet. So I thought I'd stay at university and work on a master's and then a PhD. And I got a scholarship to the University of Florida down in the South. So I went down there. It took me 5 years to do that. So in 1975, I got my PhD in chemistry. At that time, the area of work I work in now, called Earth System Science, or even climate science, really wasn't around very much. Yeah. I did a 2-year postdoc up in upstate New York, again in chemistry. And then I got a job at ANU in Canberra. So I made the jump in 1977 from the east coast of the USA to Canberra. Yeah. Well, Canberra was a sleepy little place.
I was going to say, I've been there like twice.
Well, yeah, people think it's sleepy now, but it's not compared to what it was in the 1970s. But it was a great place. ANU was fun. So I was working again in chemistry. But the area of chemistry I did was working on the structure of chemicals, not just what elements were in them, but how they were structured in a three-dimensional way. And to do that, you made a crystal of the compound you're interested in, hit it with X-rays, and the crystal would actually diffract the X-rays in a pattern. And then you would use film to capture the pattern. And then you would work backwards. And from the pattern, you would work out what the structure was. So it was this huge three-dimensional puzzle, which was really a lot of fun and challenging to do. But the problem was, even by that stage, the whole process was being automated. So by the time I finished a few years of postdocing, as they call it, postdoctoral research at ANU in Canberra, pretty much we were automated out of a job. Computers could actually look at the pattern and get the structure much faster than we humans could do. So a common story, technology changes. So then I had to make a switch, and I really didn't like what's called wet chemistry, which is going and throwing a bunch of stuff together and making a new compound. That didn't interest me. But luckily I latched on with CSIRO in Canberra, but it was in a completely new field. Well, not completely new, because it was actually in environmental physics and some chemistry. But I came in not qualified to actually get a researcher's role, but I got a role supporting the researchers and learning from that. Yeah. So I had a 10-year period based here in Canberra in the CSIRO Division of Environmental Mechanics. Now, interestingly, for the big story here is that one of the things these scientists were measuring was the flux of carbon dioxide between the plants and ground, the ecosystems, and the atmosphere. And they're also looking at low-down weather patterns, what they call micrometeorology, what happens above the canopy, but before you get up in the free atmosphere. All this becomes important in understanding how the biosphere interacts with the atmosphere, which is a huge issue now in terms of climate change. We didn't really know it at the time. Climate change was just starting. This was the 1980s.
Yeah.
Climate change was just sort of coming onto the agenda. I think James Hansen in America made his famous testimony to Congress in 1986, which really started the link between the policies, politics, and the science. And I was at CSIRO at that stage. But then the next big step, the one that really got me into Earth system science, was occurred around I think it was in 1990, when there was a big international program. It was actually started in 1986, again, that famous year, called the International Geosphere Biosphere Program. Now, that's an awful mouthful, but basically it's a companion program to the World Climate Research Program, which was geared up in the 1980s. So that was to take organizations like CSIRO and the Bureau here, NOAA and NASA in America, and the many big organizations in the European countries and in Japan and so on, and put that together into a global program to really start understanding climate change. But they were focused on the physical climate system, on the atmosphere, and so on. We were a companion program that studied the biosphere and the geosphere, sort of the physical Earth. And very importantly, we were the ones that really studied the carbon cycle and worked on how the carbon cycle worked. So I got a job with one of the projects there, which was based in Canberra and based out of CSIRO, but a different division. And it focused on land ecosystems, what you call terrestrial ecosystems. So we looked at how important they were for storing carbon, for transforming carbon and water vapor and other compounds, and also the opposite direction, how they were being impacted by a changing climate. So that got me going in that. And then after about 8 or 9 years there, I was lucky enough to get the job as the executive director of the entire program. Moved to Stockholm, Sweden, where the directorship was. So I was head of the entire program, looking at the geosphere, biosphere stuff. It was during that period that we really started developing this new, it's not really a discipline, it's because it brings together a huge number of disciplines.
I was going to ask that.
This new area called Earth system science. Yeah. So that really, that started in the contemporary way with James Lovelock and his Gaia hypothesis.
Roughly. Because the thing that I kind of wanted to ask in particular was, from my understanding, like climate science, it wasn't really like you have to have a base in a different field, like in your instance, chemistry, biology, physics, something like that. And then it kind of just like your interest kind of carries you through to that. Is that like correct?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, back then in the 1980s, you had a core discipline. Yeah. So a lot of the people who studied climate change were atmospheric physicists, for example, who studied the physics of the atmosphere, and also studied the radiation balance. In other words, the balance of energy coming in and energy going out. And of course, because we're putting greenhouse gases in, that's disturbing that. And so that's basically a physical process in the atmosphere. So those were the physicists. The chemists, of course, were working on various compounds in the atmosphere. So atmospheric chemistry was important. Carbon dioxide was one, but so was methane, so was nitrous oxide, so were aerosols, so were other things. So most of the people in the 80s were coming from a core, more narrow discipline. And so the whole idea of this research effort was you had to form teams, you had to form groups. There wasn't a discipline that did this. There were multiple disciplines who had to work together.
Is that different now? Is there, because obviously climate change and climate science has really come, I feel like it's come more in the conversation and it's more on people's mind. Is there like a base, a core in climate science?
No, I would say there's a core, but it's not. It doesn't exist with one person. Has to exist with a group of people, and the core would be obviously the physics and chemistry of the atmosphere, but also very importantly, carbon cycle research is absolutely central to the climate issue, and that involves ecologists, biologists, atmospheric dynamicists, chemists, all sorts of people. So the point is, there's much more coherent groupings of scientists now that have worked together for quite a while. and they form the core of what's called climate research or climate science. But they still have a variety of core disciplinary expertises.
Could you explain the carbon cycle and like what's currently going wrong in the sense? Because for young people, I'd say, speaking as like someone in my early 20s, there's this sense of anxiety, I'll say, like that everything's fucked kind of thing. And then it's like doom kind of thing. So I was hoping you could shed a bit of light on what is actually going on and also the avenues of like how to get out of that if they're still like achievable and attainable.
Yeah, well, look, that's a huge question. Probably take the rest of our interview. Yeah, carbon cycle, which is what you asked about.
Start with carbon cycle.
Yeah, okay. So basically, carbon is fundamental for life on the planet. We're a carbon-based life form. So it's a very interesting element because it bonds with so many different other things. It forms the backbone of life itself, and so on. And by the way, I'll just put a plug in. At the end of this month, there's a movie coming out, produced jointly by Australian and Canadian groups called Carbon, an unauthorized biography.
Yeah.
Fantastic movie. It'll be in the cinemas. Go see it because it'll explain what carbon is all about.
Yeah.
We are a carbon life form. But of course, carbon plays many roles in how the Earth system, as we call it, operates. And one of the important roles, it actually modulates the energy balance at the Earth's surface. So as we all know, we are driven by sun. So the energy comes in the form of light from sunlight and ultraviolet radiation that you can't see, but it can burn your skin and so on. So that radiation is coming in. It heats up the surface of the Earth. The surface of the Earth has to give heat back up or else we would burn up. So the planet's pretty clever. It actually can generate a balance. So it balances the amount of heat coming in from the sun by heat energy, I should say. And the sun's energy is not heat. It's ultraviolet and visible energy, different wavelength. That's important. So it's a much shorter wavelength. But the Earth gives out an equivalent amount of energy via heat, longer wavelength. So it's also energy, and it balances, and it has been in balance for about the last 12,000 years. It goes through cycles, and that's the difference between ice ages and warm periods. These are natural. But our baseline for looking at contemporary climate change is what's called the Holocene, the last 12,000 years. And it's been in balance. Temperature's been very even, very nice climate. But what happens, of course, is that heat that goes out from the Earth's surface to maintain the balance, some of that gets trapped by gases in the atmosphere. The most important of them is CO2. And it's a good thing it does because it makes the Earth's surface about 33 degrees warmer than it would otherwise be. We'd be frozen otherwise.
33 degrees, did you say?
Yeah, about 33. So basically what happens is if there was no atmosphere, the Earth would equilibrate at a temperature that's 33 degrees colder than it is now.
Yeah, okay.
So what happens is the CO2 goes out, instead of going straight out into the outer space, what it does is some of it gets trapped by gases in the atmosphere, the most important of which is carbon dioxide. I could go into the basic chemistry, but basically the vibration mode of a carbon-oxygen bond in CO2 vibrates at the same energy as some of this heat coming out, same wavelength. So it traps it. Basically, look at it this way. CO2 as a molecule traps some of the heat. It excites it, gets excited, and then it releases it. But some of that heat goes back down. So that's extra heat that comes back down, warms the Earth's surface. And so enough of that rebalancing occurs to raise the temperature of the Earth's surface by 33 degrees, or about 16 degrees above freezing, zero. That's about, I think it's about 14 or 16. I can't remember exactly which one it is. It's about in that area of what the temperature is on average around the planet.
And how fragile is this system?
It's very robust. It gets shocks from volcanoes, it gets shocks from all sorts of things, and it equilibrates very well. So it's a very resilient system.
Yeah.
Until we came along. That's the problem. Because CO2 concentration has been very steady. I should also mention it's been around 280 parts per million. That doesn't sound like much, but the parts per million is the fact that 99% of the atmosphere is two gases, nitrogen and oxygen. Oxygen is important. We don't live without oxygen, so we have to breathe that. Those two together comprise 99%, but they are transparent to the heat going out. They don't play any role whatsoever. So even though CO2 is a small percentage of the overall composition of the atmosphere, it's a very big percentage of the 1% that actually matters for the climate. It's the most important gas. So its concentration has been steady over this last 12,000 years, but it's a dynamic cycle because CO2 is the lifeblood of plants. Plants have to take up CO2 through photosynthesis. They turn them into carbohydrates, which forms the structure and the material of plants. Animals eat them, and that's what we get our energy from, eating the plants and then eating some of the animals. But that's all solar energy that comes down with CO2, the combination of solar energy, CO2. But the biosphere emits CO2 as things decompose. And there's a balance between CO2 uptake and CO2 release. The ocean also takes up CO2 because it's soluble in ocean water, but can also outgas CO2. So basically it's a dynamic equilibrium. And that means two things. One is the concentration of CO2 is very constant, steady at about 280 parts per million. And that means the temperature is very steady. So it's a very intricate, but very robust, complex system that runs at this equilibrium. And that's the climate of the planet that we humans have developed, agriculture, villages, cities, and so on. We've been around for about 200 to 300,000 years. We've been through two ice age warm period cycles. But the other two, or one or two warm periods were very abrupt, and humans really hadn't spread around to many of the continents yet. We were mostly still in Africa. So it's only this last 12,000 year period that humans have already been spreading out and been inhabiting every continent, including this one. And it's only during that period we were able to develop agriculture, village, cities, and so on. So our reference point is the 12,000 years of the Holocene. That's the reference point against which we measure climate change.
Okay. And you said since we've come along, so obviously we've emitted more carbon into the atmosphere and we're cutting down trees and et cetera, everything everyone already knows. What's the impact, like from what I'm seeing around me, Australia, obviously, bushfires, flooding, there was like an earthquake in Melbourne a few months ago, just random stuff that I wouldn't expect would be happening, or just extreme climate change, climate differences in the environment. Is this like as a result of everything that's going on? Like, is it the here and now where we're seeing the impacts of hundreds of years of like being reckless with the environment, and how far is that to go?
Yeah, very good question. We can take earthquakes out of the picture here. They're not very much affected by climate change.
Okay, sweet. I was worried about that because I'm like, fuck, earthquake in Melbourne, we're all going to shake.
They're affected mainly by what's called plate tectonics and the very, very slow movement of the plates on the surface of the earth. And they grind together every so often and can generate an earthquake.
Aren't we in the center of a plate? That's why I was so confused.
No, well, yeah, sorry. Australia's in the center of a plate, but there are minor tremors. Newcastle, for example, had a fairly bad earthquake. I think it was in the 1980s. But the country that's really on the firing line is New Zealand, because it sits right on one of the boundaries of two big plates. And so that's why the volcanic activity, earthquakes, et cetera, there. Yeah. But let's get back to climate change and talk a little bit about that. So basically what humans have done is through our activities, we've started emitting CO2. Now, land use change is one of those. That's the term we use for deforestation, other changes we make as we grow, develop agriculture. And that really started obviously building up for thousands of years ago. But it was so small that the rate was so small and the areas were still, although large, the activities were not very significant. In other words, there was tree thinning, clearing, trees regrew, and so on. You really can't see an imprint of that in the atmosphere.
What time period is this?
So we're talking about the beginning of agriculture, maybe 10,000 years.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Going up to the present. So we were emitting small amounts of CO2 at a slow rate, but the system could handle it. And there was no increase really in CO2. There was one increase from about 260 to 280 parts per million about 7,000 years ago, but that came from the ocean. The ocean stores a huge amount of CO2. And interestingly, sea levels were still rising after the last ice age, up until about 7,000 years ago. And ocean circulation shifted when sea level steadied, and there was some upwelling, and it brought some carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So from 7,000 years to the present, it's been steady around 280 parts per million, despite humanity growing, but very slowly, and agriculture growing, but it was not a dominant or even an important factor. So what was the important factor? The Industrial Revolution was it, because that was when we started at larger and larger scales to take fossil carbon, not active carbon. Carbon in trees is active. Trees grow, they die, they decompose, CO2 goes up. We just short-circuited that a bit by taking the tree out, putting the CO2 up a bit earlier, but it comes back down as in regrowth and so on. So you didn't see any real change in atmospheric CO2. But what we started doing with the Industrial Revolution in England in the late 1700s is we started mining coal. Now that's not part of the active carbon cycle. That's locked away. But we took it out and we started burning it. And when you burn it, it produces CO2. That's additional CO2. It's extra CO2 that doesn't exist in the natural cycle. And you can consider early human agriculture as actually part of that natural cycle. So it was really the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Now you would say, and we thought when we first started studying this in the 1990s, that we'd see just sort of a nice increase of CO2 from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution up to the present. Well, that really changed quite dramatically by an intervention by an atmospheric scientist called Paul Crutzen in the year 2000. In one of the meetings I was at, when we were talking about all these changes to the Earth, to the atmosphere, to the biosphere, and so on. And the paleoscientists, the people who studied the past, kept referring to the Holocene. But so many changes had occurred from the Industrial Revolution onward that Paul interjected and said, we're not in the Holocene anymore, we're in the Anthropocene. And that's where this idea of this new geological epoch was. And Paul was the guy who said, look, this started with the Industrial Revolution. So we wanted to test this. So we got all sorts of data from 1750 to the present. And the present then was about 2002. And we expected nice lines going like this. CO2, all sorts of things, human population growth, energy usage, GDP, damming, of all this sort of stuff. We didn't see it. What we saw was a very slow creep up until 1950, and then a skyrocket up after 1950. So that was the origin of the term great acceleration. So basically, the real damage to the planet has been done since the 1950s onward. Now, we natural scientists, that was a surprise, but it wasn't a surprise to historians. They already knew this great acceleration. And in particular, a historian named John McNeill, who was a 20th century historian, he said, well, you scientists should have known that in a way. Yeah. He said it very nicely. I shouldn't hit John like that. But historians are already onto it about what this for humanity, 1950 was an enormous switch compared to anything that came before in our history.
So would you say maybe from the 70s or 80s, this kind of became a conversation, and then by the 2000s, it really became a concern? Because
yes, I would say really the 1980s is where the conversation took off. Yeah. There were some people earlier than that. In fact, you can go back to the 1920s with a Russian geochemist named Vladimir Vernadsky. He was already writing about humans changing the biosphere significantly, but they were sort of outliers. It wasn't mainstream in science. It certainly wasn't mainstream in public life. But I think 1980s more than the 70s, and part of that was due to James Lovelock and his Gaia hypothesis. You know, the Earth is a living organism called Gaia. And the reason for that is it challenged science, huge debates in the scientific community, but it also got into the general public. That people started talking about, what's this Gaia? You know, is the Earth really this one big living organism that we're part of? And there was strong guy and weak guy hypothesis and all sorts of discussion. I think that was a major, major step forward in starting to understand the sort of dilemma we're in now and what's happening to the planet.
Is there any controversy at the moment with what's happening with the climate? Or is it like 99%? There will always be controversy, I guess, in the scientific communities, but 99% of scientists are generally on board with it. Like what all the hard data suggests and where it's all pointing to?
I would say it's over 99%.
Okay.
In fact, I don't see any credible scientists now debating on the reality of climate change.
Yeah.
It's so well established. The fundamental physics is well known. The observations are there. We have better and better simulation tools, models that not only can, give you various scenarios for the future, they're always tested with what we know, what we've observed from the past. And our observing systems are getting better. Satellite, space-based systems, they're evolving enormously rapidly, ground-based systems. You put all this together and it's an absolutely coherent picture of what's happening to the planet. So the fundamentals of climate change, no debate, that's going on.
And what do the simulation models predict, I guess?
Well, it depends strongly on how much more we emit. And the increasingly sophisticated models also tell you it depends on how what we now call the Earth system, how it responds to increasing temperature, increasing carbon dioxide, and other pressures that humans put on it. But I think a good rule of thumb is, at first order, it depends on how much more we emit into the atmosphere in terms of CO2, but also importantly, other gases. Methane's looming up as a really important gas, particularly in short-term warming. So one of the interesting things is when you look not only at the model simulations of the future, but the observations that we have up until 2020, 2021 now, you find that the temperature rise, global average temperature rise, tracks pretty well with the cumulative emissions we've made since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So it's a nice straight line relationship. So that allows us then to say, use what's called a carbon budget. If you want to meet the lower Paris goal of 1.5, there's only a certain amount of carbon you can emit to have a, say, 67%, 2/3 chance of doing that. And that's pretty robust. So what science is doing now is putting this in ways that we can pretty directly relate to policy, government policies, emission reduction targets, timetables, and so on. So that's, I think, a big advance over the last decade or so in the science that we can do.
Okay. So there was it the COP26? Is that what it was called, the climate summit last year?
Yes, in Glasgow.
From my understanding, the summit's just, it's all soft laws, it's all agreements, it's all promises, and it doesn't seem like there's, for example, a carbon tax that kind of got it almost introduced in Australia, and then it did it. Things like that, like hard policies that would actually lead to change. From someone just watching in that doesn't really have a complete understanding of what's going on, it seems like it's just talk, nothing gets done. So as someone, an expert in the area, what's your opinion on policy and everything going on and all those, the COP summit and things like that?
Yeah, look, I think that's a good point you make, because if, as you say, this was the 26th one, the one in Glasgow. So it's been going on for 2.5 decades. Now, the interesting thing is when you look at the emissions curve over that same time, global emissions, they've been going up. So you can't see any demonstrable impact of any of those COP meetings on that curve. It's going up, and it's going up at an increasing rate. Now, that's the bad news. The good news is that there does seem to be some evidence that things are changing. When you look at the European Union, for example, they are putting in solid policies that are getting emissions down. They are pricing carbon, putting taxes on carbons, and they're probably going to put tariffs on goods coming in from a country like Australia that doesn't have a carbon price. So that's starting to have an impact. So you can see that the European countries are starting to get emissions down. They're trending downwards. And they're promoting technologies that help us get it down. Not fast enough. I will grant you that straight away. It's not fast enough yet, but it's starting in the right direction. Technologies are making a huge impact too, obviously, with solar energy, electric vehicles. And that makes a transition much more likely when people can see a way through and they can see a vibrant, well-functioning economy on the other side with much lower emissions.
What do you think of the opinion that developing countries, it's easy for developed countries to look down and say everyone needs to do the same thing once we already had our time period to use all that cheap energy to get up to a certain like standard of living, and then say all countries need to do that now? What do you think about that?
Yeah, you raise another good issue. I really think that we need to reduce our emissions faster and deeper to allow space for the poor countries to
Transition.
to transition and develop. Having said that, I think there's a huge opportunity. Again, the onus is on us and the wealthy developed world to help the developing world leapfrog in terms of technology. In other words, don't go through the fossil fuel era that we have. Jump straight into the new technologies. I recall a few years ago, I was trekking in Ethiopia in the back blocks there, and I was going by some villages that had solar, and further along there was a wind farm. They're not going to put in a fossil fuel power plant. They're going to go straight there. Having said that, those are very poor countries, and they need help to roll this out at the speed that's required to put in the grid systems that'll help them stabilize those energy systems and so on. So that's a role we can play in the developed world, is our foreign aid should be organized around those sort of goals, those sorts of activities.
What were you doing in Ethiopia? That sounds mad.
Yeah. I was just doing a trek around the Simeon Mountains. So it was a bit of history and a bit of interesting.
Not for work, just a bit of pleasure.
I like to, a lot of my holidays, I actually like to do active things and go into different parts of the world. But when I worked for IGBP as director, I think I went to 50 different countries in the world, all the way from Greenland, Antarctica to Siberia, Amazon, for all these places. So wherever I go, I'm interested in seeing what's happening, what the dynamics are in terms of societies, what's the landscapes look like, what are the impacts of climate change, can you see them? So for me, a holiday is always a working holiday, even though it's sort of fun.
I'm hoping to go to the Amazon next year in July with a friend, hopefully. Touch wood, fingers crossed. Yeah. Could you see the impacts?
Oh, absolutely. Because when I was in the Amazon, it was for a scientific meeting down in a province of Brazil called Rondônia, which is one of the areas of active clearing for cattle and soya and so on. And so we had a workshop there with people who come from the agricultural research sector, people like me, people from the policy sector. And we did a field trip. We went out to the field and saw the clearing front, where you could walk from a beautiful, cool, moist forest out into a hot clearing and just feel the difference in the local environment. But we talked to some of the smallholder farmers who were very poor. They'd come up from southern Brazil, and they were what we call the proximate causes of the deforestation. But of course, the ultimate causes were the big international companies who were paying for the soya and the cattle industry for that development.
And I guess like us, because we demand it as consumers.
You can track it all the way back. But some interesting work done by some colleagues of mine in University of Gothenburg in Sweden, and also Stockholm Resilience Center, actually tracked what big companies like BlackRock and so on were responsible for most of the deforestation in the Amazon. And they tracked the money flow all the way back to the big private sector companies that were doing this. And worse yet, I won't name any of them really, other than BlackRock, but some of the other ones were involved in laundering the profits through Caribbean tax havens. So they weren't even paying any tax on those profits.
And I bet you these are the companies that frame sustainable as their logo, potentially.
Oh, a lot of them do. There's a lot.
We had a few subjects where we had to check the actual sustainability of a company after when reading their sustainability report, and then we had to it's like you delve just like an inch deeper, and then you see it's not all of them, but like it's all bullshit.
Yeah.
Which is why, for me at least, there's that cynicism and doom aspect, which I think is felt by a lot of young people.
Yeah.
That brings me to, so there's 280 parts per a million. Is that right, of
Yeah.
carbon? And is it still like that right now?
No,
I see
no. It's up to between 415 and 420 parts per million.
Okay.
Huge increase.
Yeah.
Most of that since 1950.
Okay. And so we're aiming to not rise the global temperature up by 1.5 degrees. How many particles would that equate to per million?
We're already at 1.5 if it wouldn't be for the cooling effect of aerosols, basically air pollution. That actually air pollution cools the surface of the planet. And it does that by scattering sunlight coming in. So less of it hits the surface. But if you stripped out that cooling effect, which is about 0.4 of a degree, we'd be at 1.5 today. And in fact, the system isn't. And the system isn't in equilibrium, so it would even creep up a few tenths of a degree if we had emissions to net zero. When you look at the IPCC projections, in other words, they take these very sophisticated Earth system models, they call them, and project out depending on our emission trajectory in the future. And they have a number of various assumptions. One is we really get our act together, vigorously reduce emissions, hit net zero by 2050. And then they have a really bad one where we keep increasing emissions to the middle of the century and keep them high. And then they have ones in between. But when you take the best one, the one that reduces emissions fastest, you still breach 1.5, even with the aerosols, by the middle of the century. So temperatures range from about 1.6 to 2.5, middle of the century. So we're going to hit 1.5.
How long will we feel the impacts of that, and what are the impacts of that?
Well, I mean, we will feel the impacts pretty quickly. You will feel extreme heat quickly. There's no
What's considered extreme heat?
Extreme heat depends on where you are. Extreme heat in Iceland is different from extreme heat in Alice Springs.
In Sydney.
In Sydney. So I'll keep an Australian context here. We're reasonably used to, even before climate change and temperatures.
We've had some hot days.
No, we get 30 degrees plus. That's not unusual. Out in the center, upper 30s is not unusual. But look, we've hit mid 40s in Melbourne. We hit 44 in Canberra. At one day, I think a year or two ago, Penrith had the hottest temperature of any place on Earth. This doesn't happen without the extra CO2 in the atmosphere. So you're getting extraordinary heat. And remember that our body temperature is 37. So anytime you go pretty much above 35, it's difficult for humans to work outside, even to just be outside. When you hit into the 40s, it's absolutely dangerous, even if you're just sitting down, to stay outside for any length of time. And these temperatures will become increasingly common as we go into the future. So that's one impact you will see. At 1.5, those heat domes, heat waves will be worse. They'll last longer and they'll be hotter, and they'll be hitting all of our capital cities, probably bar Hobart. But all of them on the mainland are going to get hit. They already are today. Canberra's going to be hitting 50 degrees and so on, even up we're 600 meters high.
When do you think that will start?
But it depends on when we hit 1.5. It's possible we could hit it in the 1930s. Pretty certain we're going to hit it in the 1940s. So we're talking about your generation, certainly going to see that, feel that, suffer through it. But other things are going to happen too. Severe droughts are going to become more severe because rainfall patterns are already shifting, and that shift will intensify. By shifting, I mean in the cool season, rainfall is dropping off in the southeast. So that's sort of the breadbasket, Murray-Darling Basin from sort of northern New South Wales around to South Australia. That's starting to drop off. The drop off is actually a little bit more pronounced in southwest WA, which is where their wheat belt is. So basically, our major growing areas are now already suffering from lower rainfalls on average. And that's projected by all the climate models to continue and worsen. Okay, so you're going to get worsening droughts. They'll last longer, and they'll be accompanied by higher temperatures. So that double whammy of very dry and hotter means for both plants and animals like cattle and native vegetation and native animals, that's really tough, really, really tough conditions to live in. And of course, that combination is what creates really serious bushfire weather. So when you have say, a long El Nino with excessively dry conditions and hotter than normal conditions, you're setting up for massive bushfires like the 2019, 2020 fires. So immediately we can see that. The other thing is, for centuries, not just decades, centuries, sea level will rise. And that's because of the enormous mass of the ocean. It's absorbing 90% of the extra heat from the greenhouse gases. And what's happening there is the ocean water is expanding as it heats. So as it expands, the surface has to rise. Also, polar ice is melting and mountain glaciers are melting. That water is running into the oceans. So those two things are raising sea levels. And for us in Australia, with so much population, so much infrastructure on the coast, that means increasing risk of storm surges. They're higher, they're more damaging infrastructure and so on. So I could go through a whole list, but when you're my age, you're going to have a really tough world to live in. And unfortunately, that's pretty much baked into the system. We can't avoid it.
Yeah. Is there a last ditch hope? Oh, technology will save us?
No, I don't think so. I mean, people talk about technologies to remove CO2, but those technologies don't.
I've heard that so many times, and it's like, can't you just plant more trees and that'll do the same thing?
No, because for quite a while now, 90% of the CO2s come from fossil fuels. That's new CO2. The trees, you could argue that the trees that will start to regrow really are removing oxygen that went, removing CO2 rather, that went up when deforestation occurred to a large extent. So up until 1950, about half of the CO2 emissions were through deforestation. So reforestation will take some CO2 down, but it will not come close to taking enough CO2 down to really significantly reduce temperature. A lot of people like to talk about that, but in fact, a lot of those estimates of how much it can bring down, in my view, are inflated. There's another reason: there will be limited land that can be used for that. We're going to have 8 or 9, maybe even 10 billion people in the second half of this century. They're going to need to eat. So we still will have to have agriculture and so on. So you can take down some CO2, but not nearly enough to really get the climate, get the temperature on a downward trend. Even when you look at the most optimistic drawdown scenarios of CO2, and the IPCC has a trajectory that does do that, it also includes industrial drawdown of CO2, which doesn't exist yet. But assuming it does, you'll get from 1.6 to 1.4 at the end of the century. That's the best possible scenario the IPCC has out there.
And what do you think the reality, like the real scenario will be?
The real scenario, I think, the thing that's really realistic, but only with a huge effort, is keeping temperature below 2 degrees. I would say 1.7 to 1.8 is realistic, but I would say to back up my statement, that's realistic. What I mean is we actually can do that, but it's going to take really fast and deep changes, not only to technologies, but to our governance systems, basically our core value systems. I spend a lot of time talking to people in the private sector now who are interested in this, and they keep talking about balancing climate change against other issues like employment, profit levels, and so on. And I just shoot them down straight away. Just get rid of the word balance. The whole Earth system is way out of balance. And if you don't make that your number one priority, you can forget about your profits, your corporates. They won't exist if we let this get out of control. So I think it's like a wartime effort, like the Allies did in World War II to stop the Nazis. Everything got put aside to winning that war. Now, the problem is the enemy is us, but we've got to put everything aside to stabilize the climate.
The issue I find with that is, like, I can't see that happening.
Well, that's our challenge this decade.
And
it happened.
I've read a lot saying, like, it's like the 20s is kind of, the 2020s is like where we decide as a all of humanity what's going to happen, kind of thing. Would you say the 2020s is kind of like crunch time?
Yes, definitely. And that's what all the climate science is saying, that if we still have emissions trending upwards at the end of this decade, there is no chance we're going to meet the Paris climate goals. And that means, if emissions are 50 billion tons of CO2 a year by 2030, you will have blown any chance for 1.7, 1.8, I think. 2 will be almost out of the question.
The 1.7, 1.8 that you described, the impacts on us that you've described, that was 1.4, 1.5 you were saying. So 1.7, 1.8, is that like mass extinction of animals and plants and biodiversity, or like wouldn't all this lead to just like massive conflict as well? If there's like reducing resources, there's less inhabitable land, things like that.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. That's a bit out of my area of expertise. You need to talk to social science scholars, but I do read in that area to try to keep up with it somewhat. And I would say that, much above 1.5 is going to be a world that I don't think we're going to be able to cope with, not because we can't in terms of technologies being able to live, but because of the things you point out, that growing food is going to become more difficult, population will increase. You already have all sorts of different human-made tensions, as we're seeing now. That huge tragedy between Russia and Ukraine. But that sort of thing will be played out more often when resources get harder to find, when where you grow food shifts, the food growing zones will shift as the climate shifts. There are all sorts of indicators that saying that climate change is going to lead to quite strong political tensions because of the shifting of the whole natural environment. And people, they live in places, the cultures are there and so on. And people are going to have to move, shift. That leads to conflict. So yeah, long before climate change itself gets you, it's probably going to be exactly what you say, breakdown of order, breakdown of human civilizations.
You go.
No, I think
if you had to put, I know you're saying it's like, when we hit 1.4, when we hit 1.5, if you had to put a time frame on this, what would you say? Like 20 years, 10 years, 5 years kind of thing? To put things into perspective, I guess, for people listening.
Yeah, I think I'll preface it very quickly by saying I spend a lot of my time these days studying what are called tipping points. Things that can hit a certain level of stress and they tip and you can't stop them. Amazon forest, big ice sheets, but they're human tipping points too. And I think that's what we're talking about here is, will you get to a point, and we'll never be able to predict where that is, of a combination of biosphere degradation. So you get more stress in the biosphere, water quality goes down. It's harder to get, it's harder to keep a stabilized ecosystems and so on. At the same time, temperatures going up. At the same time, there's more human conflict. You may simply hit a tipping point where long before the physical climate starts killing people, human conflict takes over. And one thing leads to another. You look at the classic major wars, they were started by some small thing and then they mushroomed. Obviously, having said that, you got to get the precursor. You got to get the loss of resilience in human societies, if I can call it that. And I think we're starting to see that building now, is that unfortunately, I think hopefully it won't be the Russia-Ukraine thing, but something like that further down the track could really trigger just a chain reaction of conflict. And once that gets out of hand, God help us.
Well, on a lighter note, I guess, what can we do as, I'm sure you get asked this all the time, what can we do as individuals? Like, for example, like, what can I do? This sounds depressing as fuck. I'm going to live through this as well. What can I do to help?
Yeah, look, a lot of people ask me that question, as you note. I would say the most important thing to do is get active in your society, in your governance system. It's going to take system level change. So those people who say, what can I do as an individual? Well, maybe I can put solar panels on my house. And all that stuff's good, but we have to change the system. And that requires action at social and political levels. So what can we do in Australia? We've got an election coming up, almost certainly in May. But already you can see action occurring at the societal level. The number of independent candidates, very high quality people who are coming out, who are coming from various walks of life saying, I'm going to stand, I want independent voices in Parliament. this two-party system isn't delivering what we need. And they're gaining a lot of support. So the Australian political system is starting to, in a positive way, destabilize because you can't count on either the coalition or the ALP having a majority government. There's been a lot of commentary about, well, this is going to have to be a minority government, and almost as if that's a bad thing. But that's a good thing when you need to change a system, because that's what can bring system change. So I think what you can do, support people who are out there from different walks of life, not professional politicians, but who are really concerned about the future of Australia and the future of the world and want to do something positive. There's all sorts of things we can do. One of my jobs was on the ACT Climate Change Council, but I spent a lot of time talking to community groups about why Canberra should actually bite the bullet. This was a decade ago, and say, we will reduce our emissions by 40% by 2020. This is in 2011. We achieved that. And when you look at the 1990 background, we cut our emissions by 55% in one decade. And that's because we had grassroots support. So this stuff's really important. We can multiply that at the national level. It's happening in certain states. Again, no matter whether there's a Liberal or Labor government, action is occurring in states, it's building. So there are these social tipping points. And I sense we're approaching one in Australia, and I think this coming election could be a good example of how small action across our society by a wide number of people in different groups tip our system. So it's not what I can do in my own house, it's what I can do with my colleagues to help change our system.
What do you think about the Greens? Because the issue I find, I'm guessing, but I feel like people are dumb. People just know the parties. They don't really want to do any work, me included at times. Like, you just want to see what's in front of you. And when you got a sheet and there's 5 random names, you don't know. And then it's Labor, Liberal, Greens. It's like everyone knows Labor, Liberal. Greens never really get enough to do anything. Do you think Greens would be a good pick?
Well, I think Greens are getting support, and I think, yes, I think the best governance system you've got is a governance system that has an overall aim. You know, we want to get to carbon neutrality. We want to get climate change under control, or our contribution to climate change. But they come with slightly different agendas. Some of the independents aren't all aligned. The Greens aren't all aligned, but they are aligned enough to get something done. Now, I'll just say as a personal vignette, I was an advisor to the multi-party committee that Julia Gillard set up as Prime Minister. And it was after the failure of the Rudd government to try to get a carbon price in.
Yeah.
Why did she succeed? Well, the Greens were represented. The independents were, Tony Windsor and Rob Oakeshott were there. There were 2 empty seats. The coalition was invited, but they didn't come. And of course, the ALP was there. And we had 4 of us advisors, Ross Garno from economics. We had social, electricity generation, and science. So but the point I want to make is, here you had people who had an overall common goal. They wanted to get something done on climate change, but they were coming from different points of view, and they didn't all agree even on how that should be done. But it took about 9 months of meetings, meeting every month for most of the day, to hammer out what turned out to be acknowledged as one of the best policies around the world. Why did that happen? People had goodwill. They actually wanted to get something done. They listened. And the Prime Minister herself listened really well. And she was very astute to pick up good ideas, no matter whether it came from her party or some other party. That's leadership. So all that came together, and we had a really good policy. That's what we need now, whether it's Greens, whether it's independents, whether it's people in the Liberal and Labor parties who are willing to cross the floor on climate issues. We need a coalition of people who want to pull this country in the right direction. And I think we can achieve it after this coming election.
What does your gut tell you?
My gut tells me it's going to, well, I'm no political expert, and I'll probably get skewered and I'll probably be wrong. But my gut tells me it's going to be a minority government with Labor, Greens, and Independents. And I think,
hopefully.
Yeah, I mean, the polls are sort of showing that. But you know, can you trust them? But anyway.
That's what I was going to ask you next.
I think, but no, it's not just the polls. It's the feeling. I go around, I go around and meet with some of the independent candidates, meet with some of the Greens and so on. And I get the feeling talking to people who are thinking more and more about climate change, that it could be tipped at this election. And I'm optimistic that it will be. And I think the combination of independents, Greens, and an ALP that understands where the electorate is going, that will have enough to get us on a much more positive track on meeting climate change, that challenge. I don't think we'll do enough on that coalition, but we'll be moving in the right direction. And hopefully there'll be enough internal momentum built in the economic system, the tech system, that it'll just take off, and we'll get there. That's my optimistic.
What about special interest groups and things like that? Like, sure, it's one thing to get these people elected, but how hard is it to actually pass things that will lead to change, seeing as you were on the floor in that multi-party discussions about the carbon tax bill, essentially, and it got taken away as well. So
and it did get taken away because the powerful interest fought it tooth and nail and got a party in that was willing to abolish it. So we know that history. So the question is, it's really hard to make the transition that we need to make. It's actually not as hard technologically as it is socially and politically. That's where the real sticking points are. A good example of that is what happened in the former East Germany, which had big lignite brown coal mines, and a lot of communities and workers depended on that. It took a huge effort and a lot of negotiation to actually get a package in place that protected the workers, that helped the transition of those communities and got out of the coal business into something new. So that's now, they finally got agreement. That's going to go ahead. I think it's going to work. So they're going to get out of coal entirely by 2038. So that's before 2040, which is good. We need a similar thing here. We need to protect communities that are dependent on fossil fuels, on coal and gas, help the workers transition, retrain, put money into putting in renewables. A lot of those same areas are good areas for renewables, developing export industries for renewable generated hydrogen. All that is now technologically viable.
What do you think about nuclear? Just as a side note.
It's not going to play a big role here because it doesn't make any economic sense. Some countries, France already has a lot of nuclear. Sweden, I think, has 4 or 5 nuclear power plants that I think Sweden has decided to maintain them until they run out, and then they're not going to build any new ones. They'll go renewable. I don't know what France is going to do. Doesn't make any sense here, given that we got the best renewable resource of any OECD country. And it's far cheaper than nuclear and doesn't have any of the nasty potential side effects of nuclear.
And I'm assuming the Australian landscape would be solar, wind. What else would there be, really? Because they're the main two.
They'll be the main two. I think and we've got enormous resources there. So that's not a problem. The question is going to be, we have to rejig the entire system. That is the grid. So the grid now was set up for a few large power stations, centralized, shoving electricity into the system at a fairly steady rate. Now we're going to have a much more complex system with a lot of different individual sources that are feeding electricity into the system at much cheaper rates to generate it and more employment. So that's the upside. But we need to reconfigure the grid so it can handle pulses of electricity coming from various forms and can store electricity when we're generating more than we need. And then when we're generating less than we need, we release that electricity into the grid. I know that CSIRO did some work on that some years ago, and they found that surprisingly, we don't need as much storage as a lot of people think. And why is that so? That's because solar and wind somehow offset each other. In other words, when the sun is shining, often it's a little bit calmer. And when the wind is blowing, oftentimes it's a bit cloudier. So those two are nicely complementary, but not perfectly complementary. So we're going to need a different grid structure, and we're going to need storage. The two most popular types of storage are hydro, pumped hydro, and the other are batteries. So pumped hydro works this way, is that when you're generating more electricity than you need, you pump the water back up to the top pondage. When you need electricity, you let it flow back down through the generators. Same with batteries. When you're generating excess electricity, you store it in the batteries. When you need more, then you can draw on the batteries. And there's been a lot of work done on that, and there's no doubt we can build a grid that's going to handle that sort of fluctuation.
A lot to think about.
Mhm.
The thing that really I'm still stuck on is the fact that the impact, like we're going to hit 1.5 regardless. We're already at 1.5, and also the impacts will be felt guaranteed no matter what. It can only get worse from here already, from like my generation being a bit older.
It can only get worse for the next 2 or 3 decades, and that's simply because of the way the climate system works.
Yeah.
And the fact that we can't go to zero emissions tomorrow. If we go to zero emissions tomorrow, we could obviously stop the temperature rise much more quickly. It still would rise a few tenths of a degree, but hopefully not much more than that. And it might stabilize only in a couple of decades, but you can't go to zero emissions. You know, the best scenario is you go to zero emissions between 2040 and 2050. That takes a huge effort. And that's why we are pretty much committed to 1.5. It's
the thing that scares me, we touched on it before, is like resources will drop, then it'll just turn into war. And then when there's war, no one, the priorities shift and no one's really focusing on this. So something to think about.
well,
I think, yeah. Say what you were going to say. Sorry, Will.
Look, I think that's true. And it's true, I think, more broadly. I think it's true whenever you get a fairly large and fundamental shock to society, that takes predominance over anything else. An example of that is COVID. All right, so COVID-19, all the effort was on how do you minimize the impact on human health? How do you get the system back going again when we finally get this under control? And that was front and center of attention. But what we didn't do was say, hey, this gives us an opportunity because emissions dropped by about 5 or 6% at the depth of the COVID crisis, saying, all right, we have to come out of this. But if we're smart and we need to generate employment and getting economies going, why don't we really put a lot of money into the renewable sector and so on? We didn't do that. So emissions have jumped back up almost to the same level they were pre-COVID. So we lost an opportunity. And that's because we can't sort of, as the Americans say, walk and chew gum at the same time. We just do one or the other.
Yeah. Do you have anything final you want to say? I think that's a good point to wrap it up.
No, look, I think this is the crunch time. We talked about this decade. We talked about your generation. This is the crunch time. My generation is still, unfortunately, the one that has a fair bit of power. We've got to do the right things by you guys and really for the rest of life on this planet, and make this decade really count. So that's my final message.
Well, thank you so much for your time. It was a lot to think about. It was very informative. I saw your TED talk on the Anthropocene. I don't know how to say it properly.
Anthropocene.
I almost got there. I saw your TED talk. That's why I wanted to reach out to you, and you did not disappoint. It was very informative and interesting. Okay. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
I'll shoot you a message when I put this up. So thanks for that. Cheers.
Fantastic. Cheers.